Every night for 5 years, the widow set 3 bowls on the table, until the silent cowboy noticed the empty chair she never touched. Snow burst through the door as the cowboy grabbed the falling bowl before it shattered against the floorboards. The widow stood frozen beside the table, one hand trembling near the empty chair by the window. Outside, the wind howled down Front Street, rattling the glass while stew simmered low on the stove. Then the cowboy looked at the third-place setting and quietly removed his hat. Why did that small gesture nearly bring her to tears? Stay with me tonight. This story might linger in your heart long after the ending. Snow drifted sideways across Front Street, hissing against the dark windows of Cedar Ridge, like handfuls of sand thrown by the wind. Most of the town had already gone quiet for the night. The barber pole outside McReady's shop no longer turned. The lights in the telegraph office had gone black an hour ago. Somewhere far down the valley, a freight train groaned through the mountains, the sound low and lonely beneath the storm. Inside Harper's supper house, the last coffee cup sat upside down beside the wash basin. Evelyn Harper dried her hands slowly on a dish towel gone soft with years of use. The oil lamps hanging along the walls burned low now, throwing amber light across the narrow room. 4 tables, a cast-iron stove, boots drying beside the back wall. The smell of beef stew still lingered in the warm air. Near the front window stood the table. 3 bowls, 3 spoons, 3 folded napkins, the same every night. Evelyn reached for the empty chair beside the window, meaning to slide it back beneath the table before heading upstairs. Her fingers touched the worn wood just as the front door burst inward under a hard gust of wind. Cold air rolled through the room. A man stepped inside with snow across his shoulders and hat brim. Tall, broad through the chest, dark wool coat carrying the pale dust of the trail. He shut the door behind him carefully, like a man accustomed to entering quiet places. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The cowboy removed his gloves, one finger at a time. His eyes moved once across the room before settling on the table by the window. Not quick, not nosy, just noticing. Evelyn folded the towel once more. "Kitchen's near closed," she said. The stranger nodded slightly as if that seemed fair enough. "Then I'll eat whatever's left." His voice carried the rough calm of someone who did not waste words on decoration. Evelyn studied him a second longer. Most men passing through Cedar Ridge filled silence too quickly. They asked questions before sitting down, asked whether she lived alone, asked who the third-place setting belonged to, asked things decent people already knew not to ask. This one only stood there waiting. Wind rattled the front windows again. Evelyn moved toward the stove. "Stew's still hot. That'll do." She filled a bowl from the pot simmering low over the fire. Steam curled upward between them. She cut 2 thick slices from the last loaf of bread and set them beside the bowl. Then she poured coffee into a heavy white mug chipped near the handle. The man sat at the small table nearest the stove instead of the empty chair by the window. Another thing she noticed: the spoon touched the bowl softly as he ate. Slow, steady. Outside, horses shifted somewhere beyond the muddy street. Snow tapped the glass in uneven bursts. After a while, Evelyn returned to wiping down the counter. She could feel him glance once toward the window table again. Not staring, just seeing it. "You passing through?" she asked finally, mostly. That almost made her smile. He lifted the mug with both hands for warmth before adding, "Cole Bennett." The name settled quietly into the room. Evelyn Harper. He nodded once like he'd expected nothing more. A few minutes later, the door downstairs opened again. Martha Doyle hurried inside, wrapped in a thick shawl, snow clinging to her boots. Lord above this weather. She stopped when she saw the stranger. Her eyes moved from Cole to Evelyn, and back again, with the quick sharpness of a woman who noticed everything in town before breakfast the next morning. "Martha," Evelyn said calmly, "you forgot your ledger." The older woman grabbed the small book from the counter. I'd forget my own head these days. Her gaze drifted toward the table near the window. The three-place setting sat untouched beneath the lamp glow. Martha lowered her voice as she passed Evelyn. Storm's getting worse. Folks are saying the North Road may close by morning. Evelyn nodded. Martha hesitated another second, clearly curious about the cowboy sitting quietly behind her. But Cole kept eating without looking up. And something about that seemed to stop her questions before they formed. Well, she muttered, tightening her shawl. Good night to you both. The door shut behind her. Silence returned. Cole finished the stew and pushed the bowl back carefully, not leaving so much as a crumb behind. He reached into his coat and set coins beside the mug. Best meal I've had in 3 counties, he said. Evelyn looked at the coins. Enough for supper and coffee with a little extra besides. You overpaid. Cole stood, pulling his gloves back on. Maybe I was cold. For the first time, she caught the faintest shadow of something near a smile at the corner of his mouth. Then it disappeared. He crossed toward the door. Before stepping outside, he paused once more beside the front window. The chair remained there, empty beneath the lamp. The wind moaned softly around the building. Cole glanced toward the table, then toward Evelyn. He did not ask. That was the thing she would remember later. Not the snow. Not the boots dripping melted ice onto her floor. Not even the sound of his voice. Only that he had looked at the empty chair and chosen silence. Instead, the door opened. Cold swept through the room again. Then he was gone. Evelyn stood alone beside the counter, listening to the fading sound of boots crossing the boardwalk outside. Somewhere farther down Front Street, a horse snorted against the cold. The room felt different now, not warmer exactly, just disturbed somehow, like still water after a stone sinks beneath it. She walked slowly toward the table by the window. 3 bowls, 3 spoons, 3 folded napkins. Her hand rested on the back of the empty chair. Usually she slid it beneath the table before bed. Usually she extinguished the lamp beside it next. Usually she climbed the narrow stairs above the supper house without looking back. Tonight she didn't. The wind pressed softly against the windows while the chair remained exactly where it was. And for the first time in 5 years, Evelyn Harper left the 3rd place setting untouched long after the last customer had gone. Morning came gray over Cedar Ridge. Snowmelt slid from rooftops in thin, dripping lines, while wagon wheels carved deep tracks through the slush along Front Street. Smoke rose slow from chimneys. Somewhere beyond town, cattle bawled faintly from the winter pens north of the ridge. Evelyn unlocked the supper house before sunrise like she always did. Coffee grounds, fresh biscuits, beans warming low on the stove. Routine had carried her through 5 winters. She trusted it more than she trusted feelings. By 7 o'clock, the loggers started filtering in from the timber road with wet boots and stiff hands. By 8, the room smelled of bacon grease, coffee, damp wool, and snow. Men talked over each other beneath the hanging lamps, while forks scraped plates. Still, once or twice that morning, Evelyn caught herself glancing toward the front door. She noticed it the 2nd time. That annoyed her more than the first. Billy Turner arrived just before noon, carrying his shoeshine box under one arm and cold red ears poking from beneath his cap. "You got any pie left? You got any money left?" Evelyn asked without looking up from the counter ledger. Billy grinned. "Not much." She slid half a slice toward him anyway. The boy ate standing near the stove, eyes moving around the room the way boys' eyes always did. Nothing escaped Billy Turner for long. "You expecting somebody?" he asked suddenly. Evelyn stopped writing. "No," Billy shrugged. "You keep looking at the door." Before she could answer, the bell above the entrance rattled softly. Cold air drifted inside. Cole Bennett stepped through the doorway, carrying snow across his shoulders again, though lighter than the night before. He removed his hat, gave a small nod toward Evelyn, then moved to the same table near the stove without being told. Billy's eyes widened slightly. "Well now, he muttered through a mouthful of pie. That cowboy sure eats here a lot for a man who don't talk. Cole heard him. The corner of his mouth moved once before he sat down. Evelyn poured coffee into a thick mug and carried it over. This time she set it down before he ordered. "You still got stew?" he asked. "Pot's fresh today." "That'll do." Outside, wagon chains rattled through the muddy street. Inside, the room settled into its ordinary sounds again. Cups, boots, quiet talk. Cole ate slowly like before. Never rushed. Never stared at anyone long enough to make them uncomfortable. When other customers left, he shifted his chair slightly to let them pass. Always polite without making a performance out of it. Evelyn noticed those things against her better judgment. By evening, the weather turned mean again. Wind tore down the street hard enough to shake the hanging sign outside the supper house. The chains groaned overhead. Evelyn stepped onto the porch, pulling her coat tight around her shoulders. Snow snapped against her cheeks as she reached for the ladder, leaning beside the wall. Before she touched it, another hand closed around the ladder first. "I got it," Cole said. She looked up at him. He had come around from the hitching rail without a sound. "You don't work here," she said. "No," he answered simply. Still, he climbed the ladder anyway. The sign had twisted nearly sideways under the wind. Cole steadied it with one hand while tightening the loose chain with the other. Snow caught in the brim of his hat and melted slowly down the collar of his coat. Evelyn stood below, holding the ladder steady. Neither of them spoke. A few minutes later, he climbed down and tested the sign once with gloved hand. The wood creaked but held firm. That ought to last a while. She looked at the sign swinging gently above them. "You didn't have to do that." Cole shrugged lightly. "Was already standing here." Then he stepped back inside before she could answer. That night he stayed longer than before, not talking much. Just sitting near the stove while the supper crowd thinned and Front Street slowly darkened outside the windows. Deputy Russell Kane came in near closing time with snow on his coat and suspicion sitting plain on his face. His eyes landed on Cole first, then on Evelyn, then on the untouched chair by the window. Russell removed his gloves slowly. "Evening, Deputy," Evelyn said evenly. Cole gave a quiet nod, but nothing more. Russell ordered coffee he barely drank. He spent most of the next 10 minutes watching reflections move across the front windows. Finally, he stood. As he buttoned his coat, his attention shifted toward Cole again. "People around here notice things," he said casually. Cole looked up from his cup. "People usually do." Nothing in his voice sounded angry. That somehow made the room tighter. Russell held his stare another second before pulling his gloves back on. "Well," he muttered, "roads'll freeze hard tonight." Then he left. The door shut behind him. Silence settled again, except for the stove ticking softly with heat. Evelyn collected empty plates from another table while Cole finished his coffee. Neither mentioned the deputy. Outside, snow drifted steadily beneath the street lamps. When Cole finally stood to leave, Evelyn reached automatically for the coffee pot. "You heading north again tomorrow?" Cole paused slightly, surprised by the question. "Probably." She poured the remaining coffee into a smaller tin flask and tightened the cap. "Road'll be colder by morning." For a moment he simply looked at the flask in her hand. Then, at her, he accepted it carefully. Much obliged. Their fingers brushed once in the exchange. Nothing more than cold skin and worn leather. Still, Evelyn noticed it afterward. Cole settled his hat back onto his head and headed for the door. As he passed the window table, his eyes moved toward the empty chair again. Not curious, not pitying, just quiet. The bell above the door rattled softly when he stepped into the storm. Evelyn stood behind the counter, listening to the wind and the fading sound of his boots across the boardwalk. Then she realized something strange. For the second night in a row, the room no longer felt empty in quite the same way after he left. The feeling stayed with Evelyn through the rest of the week. It settled into the quiet corners of the supper house, beside the stove, smoke and coffee steam, into the sound of boots crossing her floorboards at supper hour, into the moment each evening when the front door opened and cold air swept inside ahead of Cole Bennett. He kept coming back, never early, never late, always just before the lamps along Front Street burned low. By then the supper crowd had usually thinned to a few loggers, lingering over pie or card players, warming stiff fingers around coffee cups. Cole would remove his gloves, nod once toward Evelyn, and take the same seat near the stove. And every night, without speaking about it, she poured his coffee before he asked. Outside, winter tightened around Cedar Ridge. Snow climbed higher against the hitching posts. Wagons moved slower through town. Men stamped ice from their boots before stepping indoors. The mountain road north nearly disappeared beneath drifting white. Then the storm came. It rolled down from the high country after sundown, with a wind sharp enough to shake shutters loose from buildings. By midnight, the streets had emptied completely. Snow crossed the windows sideways in heavy sheets. Evelyn had nearly banked the stove for the night when the front door burst open hard enough to slam against the wall. Billy Turner stumbled inside, covered in snow. Miss Evelyn. The boy could barely catch his breath. She grabbed his shoulders before he slipped on the wet floorboards. Billy? Tommy Ellis said there's somebody out by the old lumber yard. His teeth chattered violently. I went lookin', and I think I dropped my shine box somewhere near the storage sheds. Evelyn's stomach tightened instantly. The old lumber yard sat at the far edge of town beside the abandoned warehouse ruins. Nobody liked going near it after dark, not after the fire. Before she could answer, another voice came from near the stove. Where exactly? Cole stood already pulling on his coat. Billy pointed toward the north road with shaking hands. Past Grady's old loading fence. Evelyn looked at Cole sharply. Weather's too bad. Cole buttoned the heavy wool coat calmly. Boyle'll freeze if he's still out there. It's dangerous near those buildings. I know. The room went quiet except for the storm hammering the windows. For one long second, Evelyn almost told him not to go. The words rose halfway into her throat, then stopped there. Cole pulled his hat lower against the wind and looked toward Billy. You stay here by the stove. Evelyn watched him open the door. Snow exploded inward around him. Then he disappeared into the white darkness. Hours seemed to pass after that, though the clock above the counter said otherwise. Billy slept curled near the stove beneath one of Evelyn's blankets while she stood near the front window, staring into the storm. The old warehouse. 5 years. She had spent 5 years avoiding even the road beside it. Every few minutes she checked the clock again. Midnight, 1:30. Then finally, through the snow, movement. A horse emerged first. Then Cole. Billy ran for the door before Evelyn reached it. Cole stepped inside carrying the boy's shoe-shine box in one hand and a bundle of papers tucked beneath his coat. Snow clung to his shoulders and ash streaked one sleeve dark gray. You found it? Billy asked. Cole handed him the box, half buried under a beam. Evelyn's eyes fixed on the ash across his coat. Not stove ash, blacker than that. Her voice came quieter now. You went inside. Cole removed his gloves slowly. The roof gave some way near the back corner. He glanced toward Billy before lowering his voice. Found old records scattered underneath. He reached beneath his coat and set several damp papers onto the counter. Shipping ledgers, oil purchase receipts. One page carried a name stamped clearly across the bottom. Amos Grady Lumber Company. Evelyn stared at it without moving. The storm rattled the windows hard again. Cole watched her carefully. You know what these are. Not a question. Her fingers touched the edge of the paper, but did not pick it up. 5 years seemed to settle over the room all at once. Finally, she spoke. Daniel warned them. Billy looked between them uncertainly. Evelyn kept her eyes on the papers. 3 days before the fire. Said the oil drums were leaking near the heaters. Her throat moved once before she continued. Amos told the men to keep working. Said they couldn't afford delays before winter contracts. Cole said nothing. That made it easier somehow. Evelyn swallowed slowly. My husband stayed because everybody else stayed. The stove crackled softly behind them. Billy had gone quiet now, too. Evelyn looked at the black ash on Cole's sleeve again, and understood exactly where he had been standing tonight. Inside the same burned skeleton of timber and stone, where her whole life had broken apart. Most people in Cedar Ridge avoided speaking about the fire entirely. Cole had walked straight into it during a storm, not out of curiosity, because a boy might been there. Her eyes lifted toward him at last. You should sit down before you freeze solid. Cole hesitated once. Then he pulled out the chair beside the stove and sat carefully beneath the warm lamp glow while snow battered the town outside, and the old ghosts of Cedar Ridge slowly rose into the room between them. Evelyn set a fresh cup of coffee in front of him without asking whether he wanted it. He wrapped both hands around the mug, letting the heat settle into his fingers. Melted snow darkened the shoulders of his coat. Near the hem, ash still clung to the wool in faint gray streaks. Billy had fallen asleep against the far wall beneath two folded blankets, one boot still half unlaced. For a long while nobody spoke. The storm carried on outside. Wind pressed against the windows in long hollow bursts. Somewhere down the street, a loose shutter slammed again and again against a building. Finally, Cole looked toward the papers resting beside the register. You kept those? Evelyn's eyes moved there too. I thought they were gone. The receipts had curled from years of damp and cold. One corner still smelled faintly of smoke when she lifted it. Amos Grady's signature sat at the bottom in faded black ink. Cole watched her carefully. You planning to show the sheriff? A tired sort of smile touched her face for barely a second. Sheriff retired 2 winters ago. She folded the paper once more. Russell works for the same men who drink with Amos every Saturday night. Cole nodded slowly like that, confirmed something he already suspected. Evelyn tucked the receipts beneath the counter ledger. Town buried that fire a long time ago. But you didn't. The words settled quietly between them. Evelyn looked toward the table near the window. 3 place settings still waited there beneath the low-hanging lamp. The 3rd chair remained untouched. No, she said after a while. I suppose I didn't. Cole didn't push further. That mattered more than she wanted it to. Morning came sharp and clear after the storm. Sunlight bounced hard off the snowbanks piled along Front Street. Men shoveled paths between buildings, while wagon horses stamped steam into the freezing air. By noon, half the town had heard Cole Bennett went inside the burned warehouse during the storm. By supper, Amos Grady heard too. He arrived at the supper house wearing a dark wool coat trimmed in snowmelt and expensive gloves, better suited for Denver than Cedar Ridge. 2 mill foremen followed him through the door. The room quieted slightly when he entered. Amos removed his hat slow and careful, the way rich men did when they expected to be noticed. Evening, Evelyn. She kept wiping down the counter. Mr. Grady. His eyes drifted once toward Cole sitting near the stove, then toward the table by the window. You ought to be careful letting drifters hang around after dark, Amos said lightly. Town talks enough already. Cole didn't look up from his coffee. Evelyn folded the rag once in her hands. Cole's eating supper same as anybody else. Amos stepped closer to the counter. The scent of cigar smoke followed him indoors. I also heard somebody's been poking around old property that doesn't concern him. At that, Cole finally raised his eyes. The room seemed smaller suddenly. Amos smiled, though not kindly. Those buildings are unstable. Would hate to see a man get himself hurt chasing old stories. Cole held his gaze evenly. Wasn't chasing stories. No, kid lost his shine box. A few men near the back tables hid faint smiles behind their coffee cups. Amos noticed. The smile left his face. He turned back toward Evelyn instead. Winter contracts are tight this season. Supply wagons go where business stays uncomplicated. His voice softened slightly. Would be unfortunate if certain deliveries stopped reaching this place. Silence followed. Outside, sleigh runners scraped slowly through the snow. Evelyn met his eyes without moving. You threatening my supper house over old papers? Amos adjusted one glove calmly, just advising caution. Then he left. The room breathed again only after the door shut behind him. One logger muttered, "Man smells trouble same way wolves smell blood." Nobody answered. Cole finished his coffee in silence. Later that evening, after the last customer had gone, he remained near the stove while Evelyn stacked clean dishes beside the shelf. The supper house felt different tonight. Tighter somehow. Cole reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded envelope worn soft at the corners. Letter came this morning. Evelyn kept stacking plates. Bad news? Depends who's asking. He slid the envelope across the table. Montana Cattle Company was stamped across the front. They want hands moving stock north come spring thaw, he said. Good pay. Evelyn's fingers paused briefly on the edge of a plate. How long? 6 months, maybe longer. The stove crackled softly between them. Cole watched her carefully now, like he regretted saying it but believed she deserved honesty. I told them I'd answer before March. Evelyn nodded once and returned the plate to the shelf. You should take good work when it comes. Cole's eyes stayed on her another second. Then he looked down into the black coffee, left cooling in his mug. That night, supper stretched quieter than usual. No arguments, no questions, just spoons against bowls and the soft groan of winter wind outside. When Evelyn finally moved toward the window table to clear the dishes, her hand brushed the third bowl wrong. It slipped. Porcelain shattered hard across the floorboards. The sound cracked through the room, sharp as gunfire. She froze, white fragments scattered beneath the table legs. For a second, neither of them moved. Then Cole rose quietly from his chair. He didn't tell her it was only a bowl. Didn't say accidents happened. He simply knelt beside the broken pieces and began gathering them carefully into his large, weathered hands. Evelyn lowered herself slowly onto the floor across from him. The room had gone very still. She picked up one small shard near her knee and stared at it too long. Her voice came barely above a whisper. If I clear that place setting away, she swallowed once. Feels like they disappear for good. Cole's hands stopped briefly over the broken porcelain. Snow brushed softly against the windows behind them. At last he answered, They don't. Just 2 words. Quiet, steady, nothing more. For some reason that made her eyes burn worse than if he had tried saying something beautiful. Neither of them looked up. They stayed there together, on the cold wooden floor gathering broken pieces, while the winter wind moved through Cedar Ridge outside and the empty chair waited silently beside the window. After that night, something shifted between them so quietly, neither could have said exactly when it happened. Cole still came every evening. Evelyn still set his coffee down before he asked. But now there were moments that lingered longer than before. His gloves drying near the stove beside hers, the sound of his chair pulling out at the same hour every night. Her leaving the lamp burning a little later, after closing because she knew he was still there. Winter began loosening its grip by inches. Snow slid from rooftops during the afternoons. Mud returned to Front Street. Freight wagons started moving through town again, carrying timber south toward Denver. Then one morning the cattle drive arrived. 30 riders came through Cedar Ridge before noon, with dust-covered bedrolls tied behind their saddles and Montana brands burned into the sides of their horses. By supper, everybody in town knew why they were there. Cole had been offered the trail north. Good money, 6 months' work, maybe longer. Billy heard it first from the stable boys and burst into the supper house flushed with excitement. You really leaving? The room went still. Cole sat near the stove, sharpening a pocket knife against a whetstone. He didn't answer immediately. Maybe, he said at last. Billy looked crushed enough to make Evelyn turn away toward the stove before either of them noticed. That evening passed quieter than most. Outside, the town buzzed with spring plans and trail talk. Inside the supper house, only the ticking stove clock seemed willing to fill the silence. After the last customer left, Cole remained seated at the table, while Evelyn wiped down the counter. "You should go," she said finally. He looked up. "Why's that? Men don't get many chances at pay like this." Cole turned the whetstone slowly in his hand. "Money ain't always the reason a man stays someplace." Her rag paused against the wood. Neither said another word after that. 3 nights later, Deputy Russell came by just before closing. He removed his hat and stood awkwardly near the door, while snowmelt dripped from the porch roof outside. "Heard Bennett's riding north," he said. "Seems likely." Russell nodded once. "Probably for the best." Evelyn kept stacking dishes. "He's not bad company," Russell added carefully. "But drifters usually keep drifting." The word settled heavier than he intended. When Russell left, Evelyn stood alone beside the sink, staring at the empty chair by the window. For the first time in years, she suddenly understood something frightening. She had stopped being lonely before she noticed it happening. The realization followed her upstairs that night. It stayed there while she folded linens, while she brushed out her hair before the small bedroom mirror, while she listened to Cole's boots cross the boardwalk below on his way back to the bunkhouse north of town. And sometime after midnight she rose from bed, went downstairs barefoot into the dark supper house, and stood beside the table near the window. 3 place settings waited beneath the moonlight. Her hand rested on the back of the empty chair. Very slowly she pulled it away from the table. The next evening snow drifted softly across Cedar Ridge again, though lighter now, carrying the smell of thawing earth beneath it. Cole opened the supper house door at nearly the same hour as always, then stopped. The room looked different. Only 2 bowls sat on the table near the window now. 2 spoons, 2 folded napkins. The empty chair was gone. Cole stood motionless just inside the doorway while cold air curled around his boots. Evelyn carried a pot of stew from the stove and set it carefully between the 2 place settings. For a moment neither spoke. Then she looked at him and said quietly, "Sit down and eat before it gets cold." No explanation followed. None was needed. Something moved across Cole's face then, small, barely there. Like a man hearing good news he had stopped expecting years ago. He crossed the room slowly and pulled out the remaining chair opposite hers. When he sat down, Evelyn lowered herself into the other seat. The place by the window no longer looked incomplete. Outside, Cedar Ridge carried on through another cold evening. Wagon wheels through slush, a distant piano from the saloon, wind brushing softly along the buildings inside. The lamp between them burned low and warm. Cole glanced once toward the shelf behind the counter, where the framed photograph still stood. A smiling man, a small boy seated on his shoulders. Evelyn followed his eyes. "I don't want them forgotten," she said softly. "They won't be. Simple words again, more steady words. The kind that stayed." Morning came clear and pale blue over the mountains. The cattle drive gathered at the north edge of town. Shortly after sunrise, riders checked cinches. Horses stamped steam into the cold air. Somebody shouted for Bennett twice over the noise. But Cole never arrived. Near midday, Billy Turner ran past the supper house, carrying newspapers under one arm when he suddenly stopped dead in the muddy street. A new sign hung above the porch. Our Harper, boarding house and supper. Cole stood on a ladder, tightening the last bolt into place, while Evelyn steadied the bottom with one hand. Billy grinned so wide he nearly dropped every newspaper he had. Spring reached Cedar Ridge slowly after that. Snow melted from the hillsides. Freight wagons rolled steady again. Travelers filled the boarding rooms upstairs, often enough that Evelyn finally had to buy extra coffee tins from Martha Doyle. Some evenings, Billy fell asleep in the last booth after helping dry dishes. Some evenings, Martha stayed late, counting receipts beside the register while Cole locked the front door. And every night, just before the lamps were lowered, Evelyn set the table near the window. 2 bowls, 2 spoons, nothing more. One evening, long after the final customer had gone home, Cole crossed the quiet room carrying a small oil lamp. He placed it gently between the 2 place settings. "You ready?" he asked. Evelyn looked at the table a while before answering. The old grief was still there. The memory was still there. But it no longer sat alone. She reached out and turned down the lamp flame until the room softened into darkness around them. Outside, Cedar Ridge settled quietly into the spring night, while inside the supper house the silence between them finally felt like home. And maybe that's the part that stays with you long after the story ends. Not the storms, not the fire, not even the years Evelyn spent setting a place for people who were gone. Maybe it's the small things. A man coming back night after night without asking for anything. A woman finally moving an empty chair after 5 long winters. 2 people sitting across from each other with all their scars still there, and choosing not to leave anyway. If you've ever lost someone, if you've ever walked through a season so quiet it felt like the whole world kept moving without you, then maybe you understand why that Last Supper mattered so much. Sometimes healing doesn't arrive all at once. Sometimes it sounds like boots on a wooden porch at the same hour every evening. Sometimes it looks like someone staying when they finally have a reason to go. And sometimes love is nothing more complicated than another bowl set on the table. If this story stayed with you tonight, tell me where you were listening from, or who this story reminded you of. And if you'd like, stay a while longer with us here. There are still more quiet roads, forgotten towns, and heartfelt Western stories waiting just beyond the next lamplight.